Welcome, everybody, to History Analyzed. I'm your host, Mark Palmer. This is a podcast which examines historical events and issues. The event we're analyzing today is the sinking of the Titanic. Some of you might be wondering, why do an episode about the Titanic? Everybody already knows the story. A supposedly unsinkable ship hit an iceberg and sank, proving the folly of humans. But there are many facts which are not widely known, as well as a lot of myths which need to be debunked. Okay, that's why I'm doing this episode. But why do people worldwide care so much about the Titanic? There have been an untold number of shipwrecks, and many with larger losses of life. What is it about this particular shipwreck? I think it's several factors. Number one, it was the maiden voyage. Maybe if the Titanic sailed back and forth across the Atlantic a dozen or so times before it sank, it would not stand out so much. Number two, people thought it was an unsinkable ship. As I'll address later, this is not true. But this is a myth that just won't die, that people claimed it was unsinkable, and so it holds our attention today. Number three, the ratio of survivors compared to the people who died. In most shipwrecks, either everybody or close to everybody dies, or everybody or close to everybody survives. But the Titanic had 2/3 of the people die to make it a true tragedy. But 1/3 survived to tell the horrific details of that terrible night. Number four, after the Titanic hit the iceberg, it took about 2 hours and 40 minutes before it sank. This meant that there was a lot of time which resulted in a lot of stories involving heroism, mistakes, and heartbreak. Number five, there were a lot of very wealthy and famous people on board. In this episode, I try to go with what I think are the most accurate versions of events and particulars, but keep in mind that there are still disagreements on a lot of these issues. Immediately after the survivors were brought to New York, the U.S. Senate conducted an inquiry. Hearings were also held later in London by the British Board of Trade. The critical dates for the Titanic are April 14 and 15 in the year 1912. They struck the iceberg late on the night of the 14th and sank after midnight, so it was the 15th. There's another famous tragedy that spanned April 14 and 15. Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth on April 14, 1865, and died the following day on April 15. Just over 2 years after the Titanic disaster, World War I erupted. This resulted in thousands of ships sunk between 1914 and 1918. According to Smithsonian Magazine, German U-boats sunk more than 5,000 ships during the war, resulting in approximately 15,000 deaths. During World War I, people became numb to ships sinking and people dying. But in April of 1912, the sinking of the Titanic was major news. The RMS Titanic was built by the White Star Line. That prefix RMS stood for Royal Mail Ship, meaning it was authorized by the British government to carry mail. It was a cruise ship based in Britain for crossing the Atlantic. It was the largest moving object on Earth at the time. It was 883 feet or 269 meters long. To put that into perspective, it was longer than the famous USS Enterprise aircraft carrier of World War II. The White Star Line decided to build 3 ships to compete with the Lusitania and Mauretania of the rival Cunard Line. Okay, a couple of things about the names of those 2 ships. The Mauretania is spelled Mauretania. The reason I give you the spelling is because there is a country on the northwest coast of Africa with essentially the same name, but it has an I instead of an E and is spelled Mauritania. The ship Mauretania was named after a Roman province in the northwest part of Africa along the Mediterranean and Atlantic coast. The current country of Mauritania is located just to the south of that ancient Roman province. And we'll might as well discuss the name of the sister ship. Lusitania was also a Roman province, which covered essentially what is modern-day Portugal. And you might be thinking that you've heard that name Lusitania. On May 7, 1915, during World War I, a German U-boat torpedoed the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. It sank in only 18 minutes. There were approximately 2,000 people on board, and around 1,200 of those died. 128 of those deaths were Americans. The only reason I'm listing the American deaths is because it became one of the rallying cries in the U.S., which eventually led to America entering World War I on the side of the Allies in April 1917. To compete with the Cunard Line ships, White Star commissioned the building of 3 ships to be named the Olympic, the Britannic, and the Titanic. The Titanic was built in Belfast, which is currently in Northern Ireland and part of the United Kingdom. At the time the Titanic was built, the island of Ireland had not been divided into Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. This was before Ireland gained any independence. The Titanic was scheduled for its maiden voyage in the spring of 1912. When it left Belfast, the Titanic went to Southampton, England, to pick up its crew and first passengers. The Titanic left Southampton on Wednesday, April 10, 1912, and went to Cherbourg, France, to pick up more passengers. On Thursday, April 11, the Titanic picked up its final passengers in Queenstown Harbor in the southern part of Ireland. That same day, the Titanic left Ireland and headed into the open Atlantic towards its destination, New York. On Sunday, April 14, 1912, the Titanic received between 5 and 7, probably 6, different warnings from several ships about icebergs and growlers. I don't know why, but I love that term growlers. It simply means small icebergs. How did the Titanic receive such warnings? In 1912, most large ships had a Marconi wireless system. That simply meant the ability to send Morse code by radio waves. This was a fairly new device. Guglielmo Marconi was the inventor of this practical wireless telegraph system. The people who operated the Marconi wireless on board ships were not members of the crew of that particular ship. They were employees of the Marconi Company. There were 2 wireless operators in the Titanic, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. They took shifts so the Titanic's wireless system was on 24 hours a day. That was not the case on some other ships. In particular, the SS Californian only had 1 Marconi operator, Cyril Evans. Around 7:30 that night, Evans sent an ice warning to the Titanic. Some of these times are hard to pin down because the witnesses contradict each other, and reading their testimony, they go back and forth between ship's time and New York time. Harold Bride gave that warning to the bridge. If you're not familiar with that term, the bridge is the command center on the ship. Now it's probably a good time to mention a few other nautical terms. The front of the ship is called the bow, and the back of the ship is called the stern. When facing forward, the right-hand side is called starboard, and the left side is called port. The captain of the Titanic was a man named Edward, or E.J. Smith. He was 62 years old and had a lot of experience. But in my opinion, he is the primary reason that the Titanic sank. Even though he had received several ice warnings, Captain Smith had the Titanic going at almost full speed at 22 knots. What's a knot? A knot, spelled K-N-O-T, is a unit of speed defined as 1 nautical mile per hour. A nautical mile is slightly larger than a land or statute mile. In more common terms, a knot is 1.15 land miles per hour, or 1.85 kilometers per hour. There's a common myth that the reason why Captain Smith was going almost full speed in the dark through an area with lots of icebergs was because the Titanic was trying to set the speed record from Europe to New York. Not true. The Mauritania, which I told you about earlier, held the speed record at that time, and all the higher-ups at the White Star Line knew that it was a faster ship than the Titanic. So, they were not trying to break the speed record. However, it appears that Captain Smith wanted to make sure that the Titanic arrived in New York on time or possibly even early. The Titanic was due to arrive in Manhattan on the morning of April 17. It's not like today with radar, sonar, and satellite imaging. In 1912, they avoided icebergs by lookouts in the crow's nest. The Titanic had 2 men looking for icebergs or any other obstructions like another ship. But there were a few problems. These men did not have binoculars. They were supposed to have binoculars, but nobody knew where they were. And the conditions on the night in question were perfect for a disaster. The ocean was incredibly calm. When there are bigger waves, lookouts can discern the waves hitting an iceberg, and it makes the bergs easier to see. There was no moon to provide light. On the night of April 14, the moon set around 4 o'clock p.m. and did not rise until the next morning after sunrise, so there was no moon to light up the ocean. Because of these conditions, the captain of the SS Californian stopped his ship for the night. At approximately 11:05 p.m., Cyril Evans, the wireless operator on the Californian, sent a message to Jack Phillips on the Titanic. This is from Cyril's testimony to the U.S. Senate inquiry about that message. I said, "Say, old man, we are stopped and surrounded by ice." He turned around and said, "Shut up, shut up. I am busy. I am working Cape Race." Cape Race was a Marconi wireless station in Newfoundland, Canada. Messages were sent to Cape Race because it was the farthest east and could receive messages that might not carry all the way to New York City. The messages could then be relayed to New York or wherever. Although it's accurate to state that Cape Race was located in Newfoundland, it is not accurate to say it was in Canada, at least at that time. Fun fact, Newfoundland was a separate country, officially a dominion within the British Commonwealth in 1912 when the Titanic sank. Canada was created as a separate country, known as the Dominion of Canada, on July 1, 1867. But Newfoundland remained independent and did not join Canada until March 31, 1949, when it became the 10th Canadian province. In December 2001, the province of Newfoundland officially became the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So what was Jack Phillips doing that had him so busy that he told Cyril Evans to shut up? The Titanic had a lot of extremely wealthy people who were paying to send personal messages to people in New York. Most of these were not important, just people bragging about having a good time on the luxury ship. But Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were very overworked with all of these messages from the passengers. A lot of people make a big fuss over Jack Phillips telling Cyril Evans on the Californian to shut up and not relaying that final message to Captain Smith that the Californian had stopped for the night because of ice. I don't think it mattered. Regarding the tone, a lot of these Marconi operators knew each other and were informal in speaking with each other. We do not know whether Captain Smith would have stopped the Titanic if he received that final message that the Californian had stopped for the night because of ice, but I highly doubt it. This wasn't new information. Smith was already aware that he was traveling in an area with icebergs in pitch darkness and yet was going full speed. At 11:25 p.m. ship's time, Cyril Evans turned off the Marconi wireless system on the Californian and went to bed because his shift was over. Since he was the only Marconi operator on the ship, there was no radio service to or from the Californian until the next morning when Evans reported back for duty. There are some generally agreed upon times regarding the Titanic tragedy. 11:40 p.m., they struck the iceberg. 2:20 a.m., the Titanic completely sank beneath the waves. You hear these times in movies and videos, and I've read them in I don't know how many places, but it got me thinking, what time zone were they in? I live in Los Angeles. There's an 8-hour time difference to London. I'm not worried about changing the time as I fly from LA to London. With jet travel, I just reset my watch when we land. But when you were on a cruise ship, this actually mattered. There was a 5-hour difference between Greenwich Mean Time and the time it was in New York. And I'm using Greenwich Mean Time, the standard time for Great Britain, even though the last port of call for the Titanic in Europe was in Ireland. That's because Ireland had its own system in 1912. From 1880 to 1916, Ireland had its own time zone, known as Dublin Mean Time, which was 25 minutes and 21 seconds behind Greenwich Mean Time. The Titanic started out on Greenwich Mean Time, so I'm going with that. Going from Greenwich Mean Time to New York Standard Time meant that they would have to gain 5 hours over the course of their trip. They left Ireland on April 11 and were scheduled to arrive in New York on April 17. So they had to account for 5 hours over the course of 6 days at sea. But they did it in a weird way. They did not just announce that they crossed an imaginary time zone line and changed the clocks by an hour on certain nights. No. Each night at midnight, they set the ship's clocks to match what their estimated position would be at noon the following day. So it was not changed to the nearest hour. They accounted for minutes also. Why was noon important? Up until the mid-1800s, each city or town set its own time. Time was set by determining when the sun was at its highest point, and that was noon. Most towns had an official clock, a clock tower, or some clock accessible to everybody, and people set their watches and home clocks from the town clock. By setting time by when the sun was at its zenith, the time in each city or town was a little different. As you went west, the time was a little earlier because the sun took a little longer to reach the high point overhead. So the time in Philadelphia was a little earlier than New York City, and Pittsburgh a little earlier than Philadelphia, and so on. But these differences in time were just a matter of minutes. The British standardized their time in the 1800s with the adoption of Greenwich Mean Time. Although it was already in practical use, Greenwich Mean Time did not become Britain's legal standard time until 1880. And although already in use by railroads, in the U.S., the federal government passed the Standard Time Act of 1918. That's when the 4 time zones of the then 48 states became the law of the U.S. In 1912, ships were still determining their local time by measuring when the sun was at its highest during the day, and that would be noon, where the ship was located at that time. This is why, when they struck the iceberg, the Titanic was at Greenwich Mean Time minus 2 hours, 58 minutes. Or if you want to look at it from their destination, the Titanic was 2 hours and 2 minutes ahead of New York time. So when they say they struck the iceberg, it was 11:40 p.m. ship's time on board the Titanic. It was 9:38 p.m. in New York and 2:38 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. And in case you're wondering about daylight saving time, that wasn't a factor. The U.S. first used daylight saving time starting in 1918, and Britain first used daylight saving time in 1916, although they call it British summertime. At midnight, going from April 14 to April 15, the clocks on the Titanic were supposed to go backwards 47 minutes. Of course, that would have been after they struck the iceberg, so that did not occur. A lot of people think that the Titanic just hit a random iceberg, but they were passing through an enormous ice field. In his testimony to the U.S. Senate inquiry, Quartermaster Robert Hitchens, one of the survivors from the Titanic, described the vast ice field he saw on the morning of April 15. In the morning, when it turned daybreak, we could see icebergs everywhere. Also, a field of ice about 20 to 30 miles long, which it took the Carpathia 2 miles to get clear from when it picked the boats up. The icebergs were up on every point of the compass almost. On the night of the collision, Captain Smith had gone to bed and First Officer William Murdoch was in command of the bridge. Robert Hitchens was at the wheel steering the ship. As Hitchens testified to the U.S. Senate inquiry, all went along very well until 20 minutes to 12 when 3 gongs came from the lookout and immediately afterwards a report on the telephone, "Iceberg right ahead." The chief officer rushed from the wing to the bridge, or I imagine so, sir. Certainly, I am enclosed in the wheelhouse, and I cannot see, only my compass. He rushed to the engines. I heard the telegraph bell ring, also give the order, hard a starboard. This might seem weird, but that meant that the ship would turn to port, meaning turn left, not to starboard or turn right. I know this sounds backwards, but the Titanic had a tiller steering system. So whoever was piloting the boat had to turn the wheel in the opposite direction of the way they wanted to turn. This is because the wheel would turn the rudder located in the stern of the ship. So if the rudder was turned to starboard, or right, that would be turning the stern of the ship in that direction, which would make the bow, the front of the ship, turn in the other direction. So the command, hard a starboard, meant that the bow would turn to port, so the ship would turn to the left of the iceberg. But steering an enormous ship like the Titanic is not like steering your car. It takes a long time for a ship of that size to turn. And ships do not have brakes like a motor vehicle. That is why, besides trying to turn the Titanic away from the iceberg, Officer Murdoch also ordered that the engines be put in reverse. But these are enormous engines to move a 46,000-ton ship and take time to put into reverse. By the time the Titanic finally started turning to port and the engines were reversed to slow down the ship, it was too late to avoid the iceberg. The Titanic hit the iceberg on the starboard side. The iceberg created a series of holes below the waterline. These holes caused water to go into the first 6 of the watertight compartments of the Titanic, although some sources claim it was just the first 5 watertight compartments. It's now time to address the biggest myth about the Titanic, that people who built the ship claimed that it was unsinkable. Not true. It was made of steel. Obviously, it could sink. There was a reference in some printed material that said that the ship was practically unsinkable. It was built with the latest technology. There were 2 structural components which made it very safe. Number 1 was the double bottom. The biggest danger for ships was running aground or running over rocks. The most likely cause of a ship to sink was not running into something, but running over something. That's why the Titanic had a double steel bottom. This meant that there was a layer of steel and then watertight cells and then another layer of steel. Number 2, watertight bulkheads. On ships, they have a lot of different nomenclature. It's not a floor, it's a deck. It's not a ceiling, it's an overhead. And a wall is called a bulkhead. Officially, a bulkhead is any dividing wall or barrier between the compartments of a ship. There were 16 watertight compartments on the Titanic. There were doors to allow human beings to move from compartment to compartment. But in an emergency, the officer in charge on the bridge could close all of those doors and make each of those bulkheads watertight. Quartermaster Hitchens testified that when Captain Smith came to the bridge shortly after the collision, he asked First Officer Murdoch what happened. Murdoch told him that they hit an iceberg. Captain Smith told him to close the emergency doors, and Murdoch replied that the doors were already closed. Time to dispel another myth. None of these stokers, the guys shoveling coal into the furnaces for the boilers, or any other members of the crew, were trapped in any of the watertight compartments, and none of them were crushed by the closing of the watertight doors. The White Star Line advertised the Titanic as the biggest and most luxurious ship ever built. All of the incredible amenities on board were the selling points for the Titanic, not safety. This myth that the White Star Line claimed the Titanic was unsinkable arose after the tragedy. The Titanic was designed to remain afloat even if up to 4 of the 16 watertight compartments flooded. This is why people thought of it as fairly unsinkable. People could not imagine a situation where you would have more than 1 or 2 watertight compartments breached and flooded. So the fact that the ship could remain afloat with up to 4 of these compartments flooded seemed to be very safe. But the iceberg had punctured holes in the forward 6 watertight compartments. This was too much and eventually pulled the Titanic under the surface of the Atlantic. The collision with the iceberg was not a large impact, Most people on board didn't even feel it. They realized that something was wrong when the engines were stopped and they could tell that the ship was no longer moving. Captain Smith ordered an inspection of the damage. He consulted with the man who had designed and built the ship, Thomas Andrews, who was on board for the maiden voyage. After an inspection of the damage, Andrews advised that the Titanic would sink in approximately an hour to an hour and a half. Captain Smith ordered the evacuation of the passengers into the lifeboats. It's time to discuss the lifeboat situation. The Titanic had a total of 20 lifeboats. 2 of the wooden lifeboats were called cutters and had a capacity of 40 people. The other 14 wooden lifeboats were larger and could hold 65 people. In addition to the 16 wooden lifeboats, there were 4 collapsible lifeboats. These were boats with wooden bottoms, but the sides were made out of canvas, which could be raised to provide the sides of that boat. These 4 collapsible lifeboats had a capacity of 47 people. Okay, time to do some math. The 2 cutters could hold a total of 80 people. The 14 other wooden lifeboats could hold a total of 910. The 4 collapsible lifeboats could hold 188. That is a total of 1,178 people if all of the boats were filled to capacity. The Titanic could carry over 3,000 people. I've seen some differing figures, but the number of people on the Titanic that night was around 2,240. At least that's the number I got from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of the U.S. government. 2,240 people minus 1,178 spots in the lifeboats leaves 1,062 people. That means that even if every lifeboat was filled to capacity, there would still be 1,062 people left on board the Titanic to die. If everything went perfectly, approximately half the people were doomed to die. So why weren't there enough lifeboats? The British Board of Trade had requirements for lifeboats, but they were very outdated. The regulations were based upon the weight of the ship and not the number of people on board. In 1912, any ship weighing more than 10,000 tons required 16 lifeboats by the British Board of Trade. The Titanic weighed more than 46,000 tons. So the 16 wooden lifeboats met the minimum. Even with the outdated regulations, the White Star Line knew better and should have had enough lifeboats for everybody on board. But it is foolish to rely on any company to exceed government safety minimums if it will cost them money. Some have made the argument that the lack of enough lifeboats did not matter because they ran out of time. Even if that were true, and there is some debate on this point, that does not justify having lifeboats for only half the people on board. All 16 of the wooden lifeboats and 2 of the collapsible lifeboats were properly launched. Collapsible boats A and B were not properly launched, but were essentially swept off the Titanic as it sank. But both of those collapsible boats, A and B, did save people. Boat A was partially filled with water but stayed afloat and carried people, and Boat B was upside down and used as a raft. To compound the problem, many of the lifeboats were launched without being filled. I have tried to find a satisfactory answer as to why some of the lifeboats were launched before they were filled to capacity. Some argue that passengers were at first reluctant to get into the lifeboats because it did not yet seem dangerous on the Titanic, and it was a scary proposition being lowered into the water from the height of a 6 or 7-story building. Other people claim that the policy of women and children first meant that if there were not any available women or children to go into the lifeboats, they just simply launched them even if there were men standing nearby. Captain Smith ordered the 2 Marconi operators to send out distress signals. Remember, this was Morse code. Jack Phillips started typing out CQD, CQD, along with the Titanic's call sign, which was MGY. But what did CQD stand for? There's a common misconception that it stood for come quick, danger. Not true. CQ was just the standard signal in Morse code that the message was a general call being sent to anybody who could hear the transmission. D did stand for distress. So CQD just meant that this was a general call being sent to anybody who could hear that the sender was in distress. Harold Bride suggested that Phillips also use the new distress sign of SOS. According to Bride, he quipped to Phillips that this might be the only time he ever got to use SOS. A lot of people think that SOS stands for Save Our Ship or Save Our Souls. It doesn't stand for anything. The S and the O were chosen due to their simplicity and distinctiveness. Morse code just uses dots and dashes. The letter S is 3 dots and the letter O is 3 dashes. It was thought that 3 dots, 3 dashes, and 3 dots would be easy to transmit and easily recognizable. So Jack Phillips sent out CQD as well as SOS along with the Titanic call sign of MGY over and over. One of the biggest myths is that the third class or steerage passengers were locked in the lower parts of the ship. Not true. Apparently, this myth came from 2 different survivors who referenced some locked gates. One mentioned that he encountered a locked gate, but it did not prevent him from going over it. And it appears that one of the crew members unlocked that gate when this passenger requested it. The other passenger who mentioned locked gates did not do so until years afterwards, even though he had given statements right after the tragedy. In those early statements, he never referenced any locked gates. There have been a lot of photos and videos taken of the Titanic on the ocean floor, and many show the gates. All of them are open, and none of them are locked. Most of the people who did not get placed into a lifeboat died that night. Some died by drowning, but most died by hypothermia. According to the Journal of the American Medical Association website, hypothermia is defined by a core body temperature lower than 35 degrees Celsius, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Below this temperature, the body loses more heat than it generates. Acute hypothermia occurs with immersion in cold water or exposure to cold weather. This was a very cold night in the North Atlantic. According to AccuWeather.com, the air temperature at the time of the sinking was right about freezing, meaning 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. But more important, the temperature of the surface water was 28 degrees Fahrenheit or -2 Celsius. Some of you might be thinking, how could that be? In both Fahrenheit and Celsius, those temperatures are below freezing for water. According to NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration website, ocean water freezes just like fresh water, but at lower temperatures. Fresh water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, but seawater freezes at about 28.4 degrees Fahrenheit because of the salt in it. And that freezing temperature for salt water is around -2 Celsius. This means that part of the Atlantic Ocean was right around freezing temperatures for salt water. Why is hypothermia worse in water? According to the Princeton University website, water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air because it has a greater density, therefore a greater heat capacity. I've read conflicting statements, but according to the United States Search and Rescue Task Force website, nobody could last in such cold water for more than 15 to 45 minutes without dying of hypothermia. A lot of it depended upon body type, physical condition, and clothing. But some people who did not get into one of the launched lifeboats survived. Here are 2 stories that I find amazing. The first involves Jack Thayer. He was only 17 years old at the time. Jack was a first-class passenger traveling with his father, his mother, and his mother's maid. Jack's mother and female maid were placed into a lifeboat. Jack remained on the Titanic with his father. At some point, Jack got separated from his father, but met up with a young man named Milton Long. Jack and Milton had met earlier on the voyage and had become friends. Jack Thayer wrote a short book titled The The Sinking of the SS Titanic. I have it in electronic format. He described how he and Milton Long waited until the water on board the Titanic almost reached them. Then they jumped into the ocean, which was only about 12 to 15 feet or 3.5 to 4.5 meters below at that time. Here's the description from Jack Thayer's book. The cold was terrific. The shock of the water took the breath out of my lungs. Down and down I went, spinning in all directions. Swimming as hard as I could in the direction which I thought to be away from the ship, I finally came up with my lungs bursting, but not having taken any water. The ship was in front of me, 40 yards away. How long I had been swimming underwater, I don't know. Perhaps a minute or less. Incidentally, my watch stopped at 2:22 a.m. After complimenting the heroics of the Titanic's crew, Jack explained, "The ship seemed to be surrounded with a glare and stood out on the night as though she were on fire. I watched her. I don't know why I didn't keep swimming away. Fascinated, I seemed tied to the spot. Already, I was tired out with the cold and struggling, although the life preserver held my head and shoulders above the water. She continued to make the same forward progress as when I left her. The water was over the base of the first funnel. The mass of people on board were surging back, always back toward the floating stern. The rumble and roar continued, with even louder, distinct wrenching and tearing the boilers and engines from their beds. Suddenly, the whole superstructure of the ship appeared to split, well forward to midship and blow or buckle upwards. The second funnel, large enough for 2 automobiles to pass through abreast, seemed to be lifted off, emitting a cloud of sparks. It looked as if it would fall on top of me. It missed me by only 20 or 30 feet. The suction of it drew me down and down, struggling and swimming, practically spent. As I finally came to the surface, I put my hand over my head in order to push away any obstruction. My hand came against something smooth and firm with rounded shape. I looked up and realized that it was the cork fender of one of the collapsible lifeboats, which was floating in the water, bottom side up. About 4 or 5 men were clinging to her bottom. I pulled myself up as far as I could, almost exhausted, but could not get my legs up. I asked them to give me a hand up, which they readily did. Sitting on my haunches and holding on for dear life, I was again facing the Titanic. It seemed as though hours had passed since I left the ship, yet it was probably not more than 4 minutes, if that long. There was a gigantic mass about 50 or 60 yards away. The forward motion had stopped. She was pivoting on a point just abaft of midship. Her stern was gradually rising into the air, seemingly in no hurry, just slowly and deliberately. Before the expedition led by Robert Ballard found the Titanic on the ocean floor in 1985, there was a dispute as to whether or not the ship sank in one piece or whether it broke in 2. Most so-called experts believe the Titanic went to the bottom in one piece. As I just read the description from Jack Thayer, he witnessed the Titanic break in half. Other survivors also said that they saw the ship break in half before it sank. This was confirmed once the Titanic was found on the ocean floor in 2 main pieces far apart. In his book, Jack goes on to describe how the stern was sticking straight up out of the ocean. The men on board the overturned collapsible lifeboat were trying to get away from the sinking ship so they would not be pulled underneath. He explained, "We had an oar on our overturned boat. In spite of several men working it, amid our cries and prayers, we were being gradually sucked in toward the great pivoting mass. I looked upwards. We were right underneath the 3 enormous propellers. For an instant, I thought they were sure to come right down on top of us. Then, with the deadened noise of the bursting of her last few gallant bulkheads, she slid quietly away from us into the sea. There was no final apparent suction and practically no wreckage that we could see." In his book, Jack Thayer described the noise immediately after the stern of the Titanic sank beneath the surface. Probably a minute passed with almost dead silence and quiet. Then an individual call for help from here, from there, gradually swelling into a composite volume of one long continuous wailing chant from the 1,500 in the water all around us. It sounded like locusts on a midsummer night in the woods in Pennsylvania. This terrible continuing cry lasted for 20 or 30 minutes, gradually dying away as one after another could no longer withstand the cold and exposure. Practically no one was drowned, as no water was found in the lungs of those later recovered. Everyone had on a life preserver. This had to be ghastly. Lifeboat 4 was commanded by Quartermaster Walter John Purkis. Lifeboat 4 was launched with 42 people total. That meant they could have held an additional 23. It was the last of the wooden lifeboats to be launched on the port side of the Titanic. Quartermaster Purkis testified to the Senate inquiry that after Lifeboat 4 was launched, they picked up 8 men from the water, but 2 later died. Only one lifeboat that had rowed away from the Titanic as it was sinking returned. That was Lifeboat 14, commanded by 5th Officer Harold Lowe. When the Titanic sank, Lowe gathered a few of the lifeboats together. Here's part of the testimony of 5th Officer Harold Lowe to the U.S. Senate inquiry. I was in number 14. Then I had 10, I had 12, and I had another collapsible, and one other boat, the number of which I do not know. I herded them together and roped them, made them all tie up. And of course, I had to wait until the yells and shrieks had subsided for the people to thin out, and then I deemed it safe for me to go amongst the wreckage. So I transferred all of my passengers, somewhere about 53 passengers, from my boat, and I equally distributed them between the other 4 boats. Then I asked for volunteers to go with me to the wreck. Lowe then rowed over to the people in the water and picked up 4 men. One of them later died. Lowe stated that he did not see any females around the wreckage. Another remarkable story of survival was that of Harold Bride. He was one of the 2 Marconi operators on the Titanic. Here is part of the interview Harold Bride gave to the New York Times, which was published on April 19, 1912. By the way, I find it amazing that I can look up online a newspaper article from 1912. This is how Harold Bride described the scene after all the lifeboats had been launched and Captain Smith came to the Marconi room and said, "Men, you have done your full duty. You can do no more. Abandon your cabin. Now it's every man for himself. You look out for yourselves. I release you. That's the way of it at this kind of time. Every man for himself." Bride then described how Jack Phillips continued to send out distress calls over the wireless. While he was doing this, a crew member came up behind Phillips and was taking Phillips's life jacket without Phillips realizing it. Bride hit the man over the head with an object. Bride and Phillips went onto the boat deck and left the man on the floor of the Marconi room. Here's how he described the scene on the outside deck. From aft came the tunes of the band. It was a ragtime tune. I don't know what. Then there was Autumn. Phillips ran aft, and that was the last I ever saw of him alive. Here's how Harold Bride described his survival. I went to the place I had seen the collapsible boat on the boat deck, and to my surprise, I saw the boat and the men still trying to push it off. I guess there wasn't a sailor in the crowd. They couldn't do it. I went up to them and was just lending a hand when a large wave came awash of the deck. The big wave carried the boat off. I had hold of an oarlock and I went off with it. The next I knew, I was in the boat. But that was not all. I was in the boat and the boat was upside down and I was under it. And I remember realizing I was wet through and that whatever happened, I must not breathe, for I was underwater. I knew I had to fight for it and I did. How I got out from under the boat, I do not know, but I felt a breath of air at last. There were men all around me, hundreds of them. The sea was dotted with them, all depending on their life belts. I felt I simply had to get away from the ship. She was a beautiful sight then. Smoke and sparks were rushing out of her funnel. There must have been an explosion, but we had heard none. We only saw the big stream of sparks. The ship was gradually turning on her nose, just like a duck does that goes down for a dive. I had only one thing on my mind: to get away from the suction. The band was still playing. I guess all of the band went down. They were playing Autumn then. I swam with all of my might. I suppose I was 150 feet away when the Titanic, on her nose, with her after quarter sticking straight up in the air, began to settle slowly. If Harold Bride was accurate, this dispels another one of the many myths of the Titanic. You usually read that the last song that the band played as they were going down was "Nearer, My God, to Thee," but according to Bride, it was a song called Autumn. Later in the New York Times article, Harold Bride described his ordeal in the ocean. I felt, after a little while, like sinking. I was very cold. I saw a boat of some kind near me and put all of my strength into an effort to swim to it. It was hard work. I was all done when a hand reached out from the boat and pulled me aboard. It was the same collapsible. The same crowd was on it. I find it amazing that Bride was first stuck underneath the overturned collapsible boat, then swam out from underneath it, got separated from it, and then swam over to it and got pulled up onto the same overturned collapsible boat. He doesn't say how long they floated on the overturned collapsible boat, but Bride does describe how one of the lifeboats came over to them. And although the lifeboat seemed to be filled to capacity, they took on all of the men who were floating on top of the overturned collapsible boat. That was Lifeboat 14, which I described earlier. Although Bride does not specify the amount of time, we know from other sources that the rescue ship, the Carpathia, arrived in the area around 4 o'clock a.m., somewhere around an hour and 40 minutes after the Titanic sank. When it came time to climb onto the Carpathia, Harold Bride saw the lifeless body of his friend and other Marconi operator, Jack Phillips. Harold Bride had trouble getting onto the Carpathia because he had frostbite on both of his feet. After spending 10 hours in the onboard hospital, Bride volunteered to help Harold Cottam in the Carpathia's Marconi room. One of the issues I never hear discussed, but I think had to be terrifying, was wondering if any rescue was coming. The people with Harold Bride knew that a rescue ship was coming because he told them. But the people in all of the other lifeboats did not know if anybody was coming to rescue them. It's now time to talk about the heroics of the RMS Carpathia. In April 1912, the Carpathia was traveling from New York to what was then Fiume in Austria-Hungary on the Adriatic Sea. Austria-Hungary broke up at the end of World War I. That city is now known as Rijeka, Croatia. There was one Marconi operator on the Carpathia, a 21-year-old man named Harold Cottam. Cottam was friends with Harold Bride. As soon as Cottam received the distress call from the Titanic, he notified the Carpathia's captain, Arthur Rostron. He took immediate action. The Carpathia was heading eastbound and was east-southeast of the Titanic. Rostron ordered the ship turned around and sailed full speed to the Titanic. Captain Smith gave the Marconi operators the wrong position for the Titanic. It's not like today with global positioning satellites. In 1912, ship's officers had to calculate their ship's positions. It didn't really matter. The position was close enough to get the Carpathia to the general area where they picked up survivors and lifeboats. The problem was that the Carpathia was 58 nautical miles or 107 kilometers away. Even going full speed at 17 knots, it would take the Carpathia around 3.5 to 4 hours to get there. Do you realize how brave this was? The Carpathia had to travel through the same ice field that sank the Titanic. But Captain Rostron risked it and rescued the approximately 705 survivors in the lifeboats. The Titanic sent out its first distress signals at 12:15 a.m. In his testimony to the U.S. Senate, Arthur Rostron, the captain of the Carpathia, said that his wireless operator and his first officer gave him an urgent distress signal from the Titanic requiring immediate assistance. This occurred at 12:35 a.m. ship's time, meaning the time on the Carpathia. Captain Rostron explained that this would be at 10:45 p.m. in New York. Captain Rostron testified that it took 3.5 hours to reach the location where he expected to find the Titanic. I stopped my engines at 4 o'clock, and I was then close to the first boat. At 4:10, I got the first boat alongside. He further testified, by the time we had the first boat's people, it was breaking day, and then I could see the remaining boats all around within an area of about 4 miles. I also saw icebergs all around me. There were about 20 icebergs that would be anywhere from about 150 to 200 feet high, and numerous smaller bergs, also numerous what we call growlers. You would not call them bergs. They were anywhere from 10 to 12 feet high and 10 to 15 feet long above the water. I maneuvered the ship, and we gradually got all the boats together. We got all the boats alongside and all of the people up aboard by 8:30. During that time, the Californian arrived. The captain of the Carpathia asked the Californian to look for any additional survivors, but none were found. The Carpathia then headed for New York City. Now it's time to compare the heroics of the Carpathia with the disgrace of the SS Californian. That was the ship I mentioned earlier that sent the ice warnings to the Titanic, including that 11:05 p.m. message from Cyril Evans that the Californian was stopped and surrounded by ice. When the Titanic hit the iceberg and stopped, the Californian was close enough that people on the two ships could see the other ship. There are disputes to this day as to the distance between them, but it seems that the two ships were approximately 5 to 10 nautical miles or 9 to 18 kilometers apart. The important thing is that they could see each other. When Jack Phillips started sending out the Titanic's distress signals, Cyril Evans had already gone to bed on the Californian. Since the Californian only had one Marconi operator, the wireless device was shut off for the night, so nobody on the Californian heard the distress signals. However, the crew of the Californian still should have come to the aid of the Titanic because of visual signals. First and foremost, the Titanic shot off several rockets which were clearly seen on the Californian. There's a dispute about how many were seen, but it appears that the crew of the Californian saw 8 rockets fired from the Titanic. Here is the excuse by the Californian's officers. The captain of the ship, Stanley Lord, was asleep. The officer on deck woke up Captain Lord and told him that a ship could be seen that was stopped and firing off rockets. Lord later testified that he thought that the rockets might have been company signals and not necessarily distress signals. But to make sure, he ordered that the officers of the Californian try to reach the other ship with the Morse code lamp. This is ridiculous and negligent for the following reasons. It's total BS that he thought the rockets might not have been distress signals. Why else would a ship in an ice field be sending rockets into the air? And when the crew of the Californian were unable to reach the ship in the distance with the Morse code lamp, why didn't anybody wake up Cyril Evans, the Marconi operator? People thought it was important enough to wake up the captain, but not the 21-year-old Marconi operator. Evans could have easily determined what was going on. In addition to the rockets, at least one of the officers thought that the ship that could be seen looked odd. I love the fact that you can read the testimony from these inquiries from 1912. James Gibson was a 20-year-old apprentice on the Californian that night. According to his testimony at the inquiry by the British Board of Trade, Gibson was on the bridge during the midnight to 4 a.m. shift. The officer that was in charge during that watch was Second Officer Herbert Stone. Gibson testified that he could see the white mast light from the other ship with his naked eyes, and using the binoculars, he could see the red port side light. Gibson testified that the ship that he could see was approximately 4 to 7 nautical miles away. That would be about 7 to 13 kilometers. In his testimony to the British Board of Trade, Second Officer Stone testified that he went on watch just after midnight. He said that the captain pointed out to him the ship in the distance. Stone could see one masthead light and a red side light and 2 or 3 small indistinct lights. Stone testified about his conversation with the captain at around midnight. He asked me to tell him if the bearing of the steamer altered or if she got any closer to us, and that the third officer had called her up on the Morse lamp and received no reply. Stone confirmed with the third officer that he had tried to reach the other ship by Morse code lamp, but received no reply. Later, Stone or somebody else tried 1 or 2 more times to reach the Titanic with the Morse code light, but did not receive a reply. Stone testified that the other ship was approximately 5 nautical miles away, which would be about 9 kilometers. Stone testified that he kept the other ship under observation because that other ship was stopped and surrounded by ice, just like the Californian was. Stone also testified that around 1:10 a.m. he contacted the captain through the speaking tube and woke the captain up. He informed the captain that he had seen 5 white rockets at that point. From their questioning, the British Board of Trade clearly did not believe Officer Stone that he did not realize that these were distress signals. Here's a key passage from the testimony of Second Officer Stone about the 5 white rockets. Question: did they come in quick succession? Answer: at intervals of about 3 or 4 minutes. Question: now what did you think they were? Answer: white rockets. Question: what do you think they meant? Answer: I thought that perhaps the ship was in communication with some other ship, or possibly she was signaling to us to tell us she had big icebergs around her. Question: possibly. What else? Answer: possibly she was communicating with some other steamer at a greater distance than ourselves. Question: what was she communicating? Answer: I do not know. Question: is that the way in which steamers communicate with each other? Answer: no, not usually. And then this great reply from the Commissioner of the British Board of Trade to Second Officer Stone. Then you cannot have thought that. I totally agree with the Commissioner. There is no way that the second officer of the ship, who had 8 years' experience at sea and was looking at a ship surrounded by ice, did not realize that those rockets were distress signals. And in his testimony, Apprentice Gibson testified about Stone. He remarked to me that a ship was not going to fire rockets at sea for nothing. Stone testified that he saw a total of 8 rockets from the other ship. In addition to the rockets, there were other visual clues that the Titanic was in trouble. Gibson testified that at approximately 1:20 a.m., the second officer remarked to me, "Look at her now. She looks very queer out of the water. Her lights look queer." In 1912, the word queer had no connotation to sexual orientation and was not a slur. In those days, queer meant strange, odd, or peculiar. In response to Second Officer Stone's remark, Gibson looked at the other ship through his binoculars. He testified, "She seemed as if she had a heavy list to starboard." According to Apprentice Gibson, at approximately 5 minutes past 2 o'clock a.m., the other ship disappeared. We know that the Titanic actually sank at 2:20 a.m. What could account for this 15 minutes discrepancy? 2 things. First, the Titanic's lights went out when it lost power, which was before the ship completely sank. That might have been the time that Gibson and Stone saw the Titanic disappear. Second, as I explained earlier, each ship kept their own time. It's not like today when everybody anywhere in the world can have their clocks standardized by satellites, primarily using the Global Positioning System. After the other ship, meaning the Titanic, disappeared, Stone ordered Gibson, "Call the captain and tell him that the ship has disappeared in the southwest, that we are heading west-southwest, and that she has fired altogether 8 rockets." Gibson went down to the chart room and woke up Captain Lord and gave him the report. Captain Lord asked Gibson if all of the rockets were white, and he told the captain yes. The captain did not say anything further to Apprentice Gibson. I think that Second Officer Stone certainly made a grave mistake, but the real culprit was Captain Stanley Lord. When you are the captain, you have all of the perks and all of the responsibilities. 2 different people testified that they told Captain Lord about the rockets, and he did nothing about it. The only Marconi operator on the Californian, Cyril Evans, was finally woken up at 5:40 a.m. by Chief Officer Stewart. That was approximately 3 hours after the Titanic sank. Evans got on the wireless and was immediately told by 2 other ships about the Titanic. Some people try to excuse Captain Lord by arguing that his failure to act was irrelevant. The people who defend Captain Lord say that the Californian could not have reached the Titanic in time to make a difference. The engines were shut off. It would take time to get the boilers going to a sufficient level to drive the engines and then sail the Californian to the Titanic. Since there is a dispute about the distance between the 2 ships, there is also a great debate as to how quickly the Californian could have reached the Titanic. My response is, so what? Captain Lord was under a duty to at least attempt a rescue of the passengers from the Titanic. Maybe they could have gotten there in time, and maybe not. And if they reached that spot after the Titanic sank, they might have been able to rescue some of the people in the water before they died of hypothermia. Think of it this way. If you were standing on a shore of a lake and you saw somebody drowning, and you were an excellent swimmer, in fact, you were a professional lifeguard, if you did nothing and later claimed that you didn't think you could reach that person before they drowned, do you think that would be a good excuse for not even trying to save them? Some good came out of this tragedy. New regulations required that there be enough lifeboats to carry all persons, meaning all passengers and crew. There was also a new requirement that Marconi wireless radios be monitored 24 hours a day. 73 years after the Titanic sank, it was found on the bottom of the ocean by a search group headed by Robert Ballard. He had started developing his own remotely operated underwater vehicle, but he needed funding for the project, so he turned to the U.S. Navy. The Navy would fund the project on the condition that Ballard first find 2 missing U.S. nuclear submarines, the Thresher and the Scorpion, which had sunk in the North Atlantic in the 1960s. This was during the Cold War, so the search for the submarines had to remain secret. As far as the world at large knew, Ballard was simply looking for the Titanic. Ballard found both of those submarines. Then, just after 1 a.m. on September 1, 1985, Ballard's crew identified one of the Titanic's boilers. They had found the Titanic shipwreck. The reason it had been so hard to find is that the Titanic was on the bottom under approximately 12,600 feet, or 2.4 miles, or 3.84 kilometers of water. To put that into perspective, that is approximately the distance of 10 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. Since Ballard discovered the Titanic in 1985, there have been many expeditions to the wreck site with many photographs and videos taken. It has been confirmed that Jack Thayer and the other passengers who claimed that the ship broke in 2 were correct. The bow and stern sections are approximately 2,000 feet or 600 meters apart on the ocean floor, and there is an enormous debris field of parts of the ship which detached on the way down. If you've seen photos of the Titanic wreck site, you will notice that the bow section is fairly intact. That is because the front half of the ship was mostly filled with water when it sank. So the bow plunged at approximately 35 miles per hour, or 56 kilometers per hour, traveling straight down in a relatively smooth fashion because of the hydrodynamic front of the ship. When the stern, meaning the rear half of the Titanic, sank, it had a lot of air pockets. As a result of those air pockets, it imploded as it sank. That is why the stern is so much more damaged. In case you were wondering, there are no bodies left on the Titanic. The various animals and organisms have completely eaten all of the human remains. But what about the bones? The man who discovered the Titanic, Robert Ballard, explained this in an interview broadcast on July 3, 2009 on National Public Radio. He explained, "The issue you have to deal with is, at depth below about 3,000 feet, you pass below what's called the calcium carbonate compensation depth, and the water in the deep sea is undersaturated in calcium carbonate, which is mostly, what bones are made of. For example, on the Titanic and on the Bismarck, those ships are below the calcium carbonate compensation depth, so once the critters eat their flesh and expose the bones dissolve." A lot of experts were surprised to discover that the Titanic itself is being eaten away by tiny organisms. These small creatures are actually consuming the metal of the ship. According to the April 10, 2023 issue of Discover magazine, we have bacteria to blame, the minuscule microbes, a hodgepodge that both creates rust and then consumes it. I've read all kinds of estimates, but it appears that within a matter of decades, the Titanic might no longer be recognizable. What happened to some of the main characters of this story? Captain E.J. Smith went down with the Titanic, but nobody knows the details of his death. He gets my vote for the biggest culprit of this tragedy. The main reason the ship sank was because he was going almost full speed through an enormous ice field in the dark with no moon after being warned of the dangerous conditions. The Carpathia served Britain during the First World War as a troop and supply transport ship. On July 17, 1918, the Carpathia was torpedoed by a German U-boat and sank off of the south coast of Ireland. Arthur Rostron was not the captain of the Carpathia at that time. He had been recognized as a hero for rescuing the Titanic survivors. Rostron commanded other ships during and after World War I, including the Mauretania and the Lusitania. And no, he was not the captain of the Lusitania when it was sunk by a German U-boat. Arthur Rostron retired from sea duty in 1931 and died in 1940 at age 71 of pneumonia. The Californian also served the British government during World War I, transporting troops and equipment. The Californian was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat in the Mediterranean on November 9, 1915. Stanley Lord was not the captain at that time. After the Titanic incident, he had been asked to resign. He had been criticized by both the American and British inquiries into the Titanic tragedy, but no criminal charges were brought against Stanley Lord. However, his career and reputation were ruined, although he continued to captain other ships. Stanley Lord died on January 24, 1962, at age 84. Jack Thayer graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, got married, and had 5 children. One of his sons was killed in World War II in 1943. Jack Thayer went into a deep depression and killed himself in 1945. Harold Bride served as a Marconi operator during World War I. He hated talking about the Titanic disaster and gave up life at sea. He got married and had 3 kids and moved to Scotland, where he worked as a salesman. On April 29, 1956, Harold Bride died from lung cancer at age 66. That's it for today. Please subscribe to this podcast. Please like this and my other episodes. Please tell your friends, relatives, coworkers. Word of mouth is the best way to increase the audience for History Analyzed. If you're listening on a podcast app which allows ratings, I would greatly appreciate a 5-star rating. Reviews really help. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, it's easy to do. Scroll down the History Analyzed show page, select a rating, and then tap Write a Review. Check out my website, historyanalyzed.com, where you will find links to fun items for all of the history geeks out there. Thank you for listening. Catch you next episode.